everyone, Ellie the Quilter here from Mojave Farms Quilt Company. Today we're going to be learning how to make cathedral windows as well as how to construct a tote. This is a free PDF download from our website, mojavefarmsquiltingco.com. You can find it there. It will have all of the supplies and cutting instructions for what we're going to go over today. So today we're going to be learning how to make cathedral windows. And it's a very versatile kind of quilting block. It's not as difficult as people think. And you can see we're using them here on the front and back of our totes as pockets. I've also used them before in a laptop cover, and I've even made an entire quilt out of this. So that's really gorgeous as well. So let's take a look at the supplies that we're going to need today. One of the supplies that I find necessary whenever I'm cutting pieces for my quilt is using my Grace Company True Cut system. They have all different sizes, and I find this absolutely necessary if I'm going to try and get straight cuts, because all of their True Cut rulers and rotary cutters have a track and rail system, which means there is a little lip here on the edge of all of your rulers, and on your rotary cutter there's a little track in there that you can hook on, and as you're cutting it can't come off of the ruler, so you're guaranteed straight cuts every time. A couple helpful tips and tricks for when you're sewing your totes. Remember that cathedral windows look really great when you have fabric choices that pop and contrast with each other. So you can see here we're using some dark windows but lighter fabric, and here we're using lighter windows but darker accent fabric. Remember also that you're going to be sewing through a lot of thick fabric, so I find a walking foot very helpful, and anytime I'm going through anything thick or I'm doing some quilting, I like to increase my stitch length to a 3. So our cathedral window totes pattern has two different options for you. There is one with added handles. You can purchase extra handles and sew them on. We also have one with fabric handles, and that's the one that we're going to be demonstrating today. So the things that you're going to need to cut out to prepare are your exterior fabric, and you're going to need 2 pieces that are 15.5 by 15.5. You're also going to need some batting because it is a quilted tote. So you're going to need 2 pieces of batting that are at least 15.5 by 15.5. I like to go a little bit over just so I don't have any mistakes there. We're also going to need accent fabric, and this is the dark blue that's on here. It's going to be the same as your fabric handles. So you're going to need 2 pieces that are 6.5 by 15.5. And same thing with the batting. We need 2 of those as well that are at least 6.5 by 15.5. We're also going to make our own fabric handles, and I will show you how to do that in a minute. We're going to need 2 strips that are 46 inches long and 5 inches wide. So in our exterior fabric, we're also going to need 24 squares that are 3 by 3 inches. We're also going to need 24 2.5-inch squares, and we're going to be pressing them all into triangles like this. And I like to use starch just to make sure it's not going anywhere as we begin to sew. Lastly, you're going to need 6 squares, and these are 2.25 by 2.25, and these are going to be the insides of our cathedral windows, whereas these are going to be the frames. So the way that we make our cathedral window blocks is with 4 of the exterior fabrics, and then we take 4 of our accent fabrics, and we're going to place it with the open sides into the middle of the square. So we'll do 4 of those. And eventually when we have it all sewn, you'll see that we put these in here. That's how we create our cathedral window blocks. Okay, so let's go ahead and pin our pieces together. We're going to do this for each of the 4. We'll pin them here in the middle. Now the way that we're going to create our blocks is by putting them right sides together, and then we're going to sew along here. We'll do that for both of them. And sew along there. The other thing I like to do when I'm making cathedral windows is to have some extra security with a little wonder clip there. That way none of my inside triangles move around and I don't have to have a whole bunch of pins. I also like to use a walking foot, as you can see I have on here. Cathedral windows tend to get pretty bulky and an even feed foot or a walking foot can really help with that. And we're sewing everything here on our blocks with a 1/4 inch seam. So here you can see we have our 2 sides sewn together and our little flaps are still open. That's okay. We're going to make sure that we press these very well, and I prefer on cathedral windows to press my seams open. Like I said before, these can get really bulky and sometimes nesting your seams makes it a little too thick for your sewing machine to go through. So I prefer to do open. So just like we did when we joined these two, we're going to join the top and bottom together. And then we'll pin here and sew all along here. So here we have our finished base for our cathedral block. You can see I have all of my seams pressed open. And now it's time for us to add the window part. So our accent fabric here is going to act as the frame for the center of our window. And the way that we add it in is just to align all 4 of the points here so it's perfectly in the middle. Sometimes I like to do a little dab of a glue stick and press it so that it stays right where I need it to be. So once we have our window inside the window frame, we're going to fold over the window frame. And some people will pin this. I find it easier just to do it at my sewing machine as I go, but we're going to start sewing here. And as close to the inside of this frame as possible, we're going to sew this in place. So you can see I have my window frame pulled over. I'm just going to hold this with my hand. I like to start with my needle down at the very point up here. And then I very slowly move it along here to tack it down. Once I get up to the very top, I like to move my needle with my hand wheel, lift my presser foot and pivot. And then I'll do the same thing with the next side. I'm just going to fold the frame over like this. And then I'll use my hand wheel just to get the first couple stitches where I want them to be. And then I'll sew the rest of this side. So as you can see, we have almost all of them done. The most important part is that as you're folding it over, you fold it over just enough so that you're covering the point of the window. Backstitch a tiny bit there at the end. And then we can pull out our final block. So these are our completed cathedral window blocks. We want to make a total of 6 of them, and we're going to press the backs open just like this. And then we're going to take 3 at a time and we're going to join them together into a long strip like this. And we need 2 strips because we want one for the front and one for the back. And these are going to become the pockets of our totes. So let's begin by placing them together. We're going to just match the seams front and back and pin it there. And again, we're going to be sewing these together with a 1/4 inch seam. So now that we have our strips of our cathedral windows, we need to start building the pockets. So we're going to put our accent fabric, if you have it printed, you're going to want to put it face side down. That's going to be the inside of our pockets. And then we'll put our batting, and then we'll put our strip of cathedral windows. And you can use some basting glue here, some spray-based glue, or you can do a couple of pins, but we're going to be quilting all along here. So once you have all the quilting done on your cathedral blocks that you would like, and you'll notice I didn't quilt off into my accent fabric, we want to leave that alone and just do the quilting on our cathedral blocks. We're going to go create this piping effect by doing a fold up to our cathedral blocks and then a second fold, and we're going to secure it with a clip. And then we're gonna do a stitch right along the edge here. Now, if that's a little too small for you, when you cut your accent fabric, instead of 6.5, do maybe 7 inches. And that will give you a little bit more fabric to work with, and it'll come a little bit farther down. So if you're still learning or you're a beginner, that might be a good way to change the pattern that will help you out. So now the most difficult thing is done. We have finished our cathedral window pockets. I promise the rest of it will go much more smoothly. So let's start working on our handles. Our fabric handles are made from 2 5-inch widths by 46-inch length strips of fabric. And the way that we make them is by pressing them in half, and then you'll open it up and press each half into that center line. You'll just iron it like this, and then we'll fold it over and iron it again. And that will give us 2 long handles. And let's take it over to our sewing machine, and we're going to stitch along both sides of this. Now that we've finished sewing down both sides of both of our handles, we're going to set these aside and start working on the body of our bag. So just like when we did our cathedral window strips, we're going to use some quilting batting, and then make sure that your exterior fabric is face up. And you can do some free motion on this. You can do some straight lines or grids, however you'd like to quilt it. Okay, so I've done some just pretty simple straight line quilting on here. And the way that we do our front and backs to make a tote, we want to have a squared bottom, so to speak. The way that we do that is by, I'm going to flip it over. And you can see on each of the bottom corners, I've marked a 2-inch square. And what we're going to do is cut each of these out, and you can use a rotary cutter. I'm just going to use some scissors here. Cut out that 2-inch square. We're going to do the same on the bottom of the other side. So that's our front. We're going to do the same thing for our back. You can see I've done it here also. So now it's time for us to add our handles onto the front and back of our bag. I like mine about 5 inches from the bottom. So I'm just going to measure and mark a light line along there. And then I'll lay my handles where the bottoms are hitting that 5-inch line. And the way that I've been estimating the width and exactly where I want them placed is I lay my cathedral blocks just over that. This is where we're going to be sewing later. And I want to make sure that my handles are just inside this seam of the outside pockets, because we're going to be stitching in the ditch here to create the pockets. So I want to make sure that my handles are just inside that. And then I can pin this in place. And then we're going to sew up each side just about an inch short of the top. And then we'll do the other side again, just inside that pocket right there. Making sure it's lined up with our 5-inch mark right there. All right, let's go sew these on. Now that we have our handles sewn on, we're going to be adding our Cathedral window strip back to it. And I'm placing it just below where our handles are and in line with the sides of our bag. And then I'll pin in place. And we are going to sew all along the bottom here. I'm going to do probably just stitch in the ditch along this top row right here. And then we're going to stitch in the ditch along our Cathedral blocks. Sew all along the sides and on the bottom. The only thing that we're not going to sew right now are anywhere in this square, just the bottoms and the sides. Now, because this is very thick here, and it's going to be even thicker when I get to my pockets, I'm definitely going to need a walking foot here. And I've switched my stitch length to a 3, and I'm going to do some back stitching along here just to make sure that any kind of pressure or pulling that happens on the seams is well reinforced. Once we have our sides and bottom of the tote sewn, we're going to leave it right sides together, and we're going to open up that 2-inch cut that we made. We're going to match up the seams. A lot of people like to nest their seams right here. And we're going to get a clip in place. And we need to open it up enough so that we end up with a straight line here. That's what we're going to sew to create that boxed bottom of our tote. So now we have both sides of our tote bottom closed, and we're just gonna set this aside for a minute. We're gonna work on the lining, the inside lining for it. Okay, so here we have our inside lining fabric, and I'm just now realizing that I actually forgot to mention this when we were talking about supplies. So if you're taking notes, add this in. These are the same dimensions as your exterior fabric, which is your front and back of the tote. So it's 2 15.5-inch squares, and just like with the front and back of our tote that we just did, we're going to notch out 2 inches here. And then to create the lining, we are going to put 2 of them right sides together. And just the same as we just did with our exterior fabric, we're going to sew all along the sides, both sides. And then on the bottom, we're only going to sew the first couple inches on each side. And we're going to leave this middle part here open for turning. Now, because this is our inside lining and it's not really thick, I'm only going to use a 1/4 inch seam here. All right, so we've sewn all along the sides and part of the bottom. We're going to do the same thing that we did on our front and back tote and open these up, leaving the lining right sides together. And we're going to pin all along here and sew it shut. Now we have our inside out tote and our inside out lining. We're going to leave the lining inside out and we're going to turn our tote right side out. And it is really coming together, as you can see. Want to make sure that we poke out all those corners there that we just sewed together. And then we're going to take our inside out lining and we're going to put the tote inside that. Now with our handles, we're going to tuck those in between the lining and the tote on both sides. And then once we have everything tucked in neatly, we're going to match up the seams on the sides and add a clip. Do the same thing on this side and add a clip. And then the way I like to do it is pull it tight so I can kind of find where the middle is, and then I'm going to add a couple more around the tote. Make sure that your handles are tucked down in there because you don't want to sew over them. As we sew around to this, we're just sewing the lining and the top of the tote. That's it. Okay, now let's sew all around the edge. Now because this is thicker, I'm leaving my walking foot on and I'm using a 3/8 or 1/2 inch seam. I've also increased my stitch length to a 3, just like when I was doing some of that quilting. We've sewn all the way around our tote and now we get to see it come together. This hole that we left in the lining is where you're going to pull everything out. Hopefully you left yourself a big enough hole. So now you can see we have our tote here and our lining here. And just like we did with our tote, we want to make sure that we poke out those corners there. And the only thing we have left to do is to fold in a seam on the lining. And I'm going to put a clip along here. And along here. And then we'll sew it shut. As we're sewing along here to close up our lining, we want to keep it as close to the edge as possible. Some people also like to hand sew this with a ladder stitch, or I find that It's in the bottom of a bag and I don't really notice it, so I tend to just machine stitch mine. So as you can see, I've sewn just right along the very edge here, just enough to seal it up. Now we take our lining and we shove it inside the bag, making sure that it's deep down into the corners. And the last thing we need to do, and this is a choice you can make or not make, it's totally your style. Once I have it inside, I like to secure the lining and making sure that it's not going to come out at any time. So I like to iron it or just pinch it really well along the edge so that I get right up to the edge of the seam. And sometimes I'll even pin it or clip it, and I'll sew with a tiny, tiny seam right along the edge. So here's our completed tote for today. I hope you enjoyed this project. Remember that it is a free PDF download available on our website at mojavefarmsquiltingco.com.